Good evening. This is the second sketch on the history of slavery in the 19th century. In the first part, we reviewed some of the contributing factors to the dramatic expansion of slavery in the 19th century. And to recall, and not necessarily in order of importance, one, the upsurge of the cotton as the prime commodity of the 19th century, with massive export of American cotton to England and to the Manchester mills. Then the invention of the cotton gin just before the beginning of the century, which was the cotton gin instrumental in dramatically increasing the production of cotton. Then the so-called Louisiana Purchase, or we could say Louisiana Sale, which added 1/3 of the continent to the United States. And then the Indian Removal Act of 1831, whereby all Native Americans living in the south of the United States were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. Incidentally, it is not said or usually assumed that what amounted to an ethnic cleansing of Native American was due to their inability to integrate within the white community, but this was not so. Many Native Americans actually did what they could to integrate. And at the time of the Indian Removal Act, for example, the Cherokees of Florida and Georgia even published their own newspaper in English or dual languages. But then, as now, the voice of power trumps the power of truth, and therefore it trumps the voice of reason. You can imagine what it was for an entire people to travel 1,500 miles on foot to a land they did not know nor wanted to go to. About 1/3 of the ethnically cleansed Native Americans died during the way. And in this episode, then, we will review various aspects of the then Southwest, notably and especially Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and parts of Georgia. The first symptoms of the condition that led to the withdrawal of the Confederate States from the Union, the conjoined influence of politics and banking in the commodification of slaves, and the creation of the bubbles, similar to our current housing bubble, or recent. In fact, conditions arose in the southern states, and notably Louisiana, the conditions found themselves in the same which Greece found herself today. Some aspects of the slave trade and the slave trading mentality which are usually omitted from standard texts on the matter, for being, let us say, politically incorrect. And more than mentality, I think we should better say mode of thought. And this will be outside the topic subject, but just as an example of a mode of thought, we are now used to taking for granted that the President or Secretary of State or members of the cabinet, taking for granted such as Assad, the President of Syria, Assad must go, without any channel of the mainstream media saying, just a moment, who are you to impose your will on a country 10,000 miles away from yours? Not to speak of the lies, literally bigger than life, said about currently Ukraine, whose history is completely distorted to fit whatever scheme of prevarication may fit the political view of the moment. But back to our subject. Let's examine as best as we can what was life in the newly discovered El Dorado of wealth in the then southeast of the United States. Southeast meaning the states of Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, primarily, and considering also Florida and the Florida Panhandle, which at the time still belonged to Spain, where incidentally in Spain and in Florida slavery was banned. To give you a feel of the spirit of the times, here is the official justification for the seizing of the town and of the surrounding areas belonging to Spain. The Spanish provinces of East and West Florida, having for some years past been in a revolutionary insurrectional state, and the government of Spain being unable from its embarrassment in Europe to maintain its authority over them, the American government now determined to occupy the town of Mobile, to which it has acquired the title by the purchase of Louisiana, but which still remains in the possession of the Spanish authorities. The embarrassment in Europe that refers to the situation in Spain during the Empire of Napoleon. As you may recall, Napoleon succeeded in establishing a Spanish king deference to France in Spain, but England was plotting to intervene, as eventually she did. As the American General Wilkinson approached Mobile, Alabama, he sent a message to the very small Spanish garrison as follows: "We have to relieve the garrison which you command from the occupancy of a post within the legitimate limits of the United States." Mobile was not within the territory of the Louisiana Purchase, but what is meaningful then as now is the invention of some arbitrary and presumably logical excuse to steal a land in this case. In our current history, the equivalent are if you like, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or whatever other excuses have been invented to justify the destruction of Libya, the ongoing destruction of Syria, plus various coups d'etat in sundry countries worldwide. Now, in the case of Florida, it wasn't long before, under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the whole of Florida was taken over from Spain. And in that instance, it was not even deemed necessary to find an excuse for removing the Spaniards from a land they had colonized for a very long time, as the names of the state itself and many towns and cities still are witness to. It is a permanent puzzle for the historians to establish whether one man rises to power because he symbolizes an age, or whether it is the man who rises to power to set the tone of the age. More likely, in the assumed and unavoidable conflict for supremacy and competition, the forces with the greatest power, and in our age we would say the financial, impose on the rest of the country the character that best embodies their interest. Still, to maintain a veneer of legitimacy, if you like, however thin, these maneuvers are usually disguised by a costly and relentless media campaign. The media campaign aims at convincing the man that the cabal, for lack of a better word, the cabal is there to represent the interests of the people, meaning the overwhelming majority, who are in the end the losers in the choice, the losers having chosen the leader. Let us examine then, as best as we can, what was the spirit and the practice of the Andrew Jackson times that endured well after he left the presidency in 1837. We could say the spirit of the time until the Civil War of 1861. Incidentally, during the election of 1828, Jackson's opponents referred to him as a jackass. Jackson liked the name and used the jackass as a symbol for a while, but it died out. However, it later became the symbol for the Democratic Party when cartoonist by the name of Thomas Nast popularized it, and it is the same Nash who popularized the elephant as a symbol of the Republican Party. We have to select prominent issues of the Jackson's era, that is, and not necessarily in order of importance. Let's take the foreign policy, for example. We have already seen in the historical sketches about the War of 1812, we have already seen how the newly established U.S. attempted to annex Canada unsuccessfully. Jackson had created a force of 2,000 volunteers for that purpose, but for various reasons that force was directed towards the south rather than Canada. Yet, In his mission statement on foreign policy, Jackson said, "With foreign nations it would be my study to preserve peace and to cultivate friendships on fair and honorable terms." But he already let it be known that with the Louisiana Purchase he thought the U.S. had the right to annex Texas, who was at the time an established and legitimate part of Mexico. On domestic economy, the Jackson administration applied enormous import duties on foreign manufacturers, and that became known as the Tariff of Abomination. Therefore, as a consequence, American factories could undersell various British goods. Remember that Britain in the 19th century was the hub of the Industrial Revolution. But the American consumer ended up paying the cost. And this, by the way, is what prompted some Southern politicians to complain bitterly and already make noises about removing the Southern states from the Union, which I think is incorrect, as the South at the time had not yet completely transformed slaves into slavery and commodities and in hedge funds. Rebellions were in the air, which are usually overlooked in official history books or narratives, such as the Denmark-Vesey rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina, and this Mr. Vesey was executed, and today, however, he has a monument in Charleston. Still, regarding the Tariff of Abomination, when some historians say that it was the labor of the slaves that industrialized the North, they are not far from the truth, because from the profit that made in the South with the sale of cotton, the profit was diverted to the North via the means of import tax on manufactured goods. And as for setting the tone for the country, so to speak, the Jackson administration was plagued, or maybe characterized, by bitter internal conflicts. Half the members of Jackson's cabinet and their wives labeled the wives of the other half as whores. And we can say that the tone of the Congress was very different from the tone that inspired the lofty and overall nobly worded Declaration of Independence only a relatively short time before. Jackson himself had killed an adversary in a duel, and in another duel was hit by a bullet that remained in his bones for the rest of his life. Another curious trait of Andrew Jackson's philosophy, or maybe frame of mind, was his mistrust of banks, which led, as I hope we can show, to an economic collapse almost identical, at least in its main characteristics, to the recent housing bubble of recent memory. In Jackson's declared dislike of banks, we can see a parallel with Ronald Reagan's declared and paradoxical dislike of government. He famously said that government is not a solution, government is the problem, except that during the Reagan administration, the government payroll increased by 300,000 employees, which to some of you, at least I hope, may seem a curious solution. That is, solving the problem by increasing the size of it. And my insistence in drawing parallels between the past and the present reflects the notion that to learn about the present in the light of the past means also to learn about the past in the light of the present. Now, as for the function, and as the function of history is to promote a more profound understanding of both the past and the present through the interrelation between them, and we should look at it that way. Returning to Jackson's alleged dislike of banking, one important bank at the time was the Second Bank of the United States, or BUS, B-U-S for short. This bank had, let us say, a conservative policy, both in lending and in printing money, meaning that it would expect its subsidiary banks throughout the states to limit their lending and the printing of money based on their so-called fractional reserve, that is, keeping their lending within limits based on what actually immediately redeemable assets were available, typically gold, the gold they would have in reserve. And now this policy tended both to simultaneously promote and restrict lending, that is, promote lending to bigger and already established creditors to the exclusion of others, which in turn prevented runaway speculation. Now, the populist dislike for this bank was not because it printed its own money, but because it should have printed even more. More lending available would mean, in the instance, an increase in the value of slaves as collateral, more land purchasable and planted with cotton, with the assumption that the price of cotton would only go up and continue to rise and immediately and never go down, just as it happened with the housing bubble not so long ago. But there were also other motives behind the cotton fever, which also meant the slave fever. These motives are not usually mentioned, or at least delved on in official narratives, because of their, let us say, politically incorrect nature. Slavery directly unchecked dominance, promoted dominance, and promised unlimited fulfillment of unrestrained desire. That made the behavior of entrepreneurs particularly volatile, risky, profitable, and disastrous. In the 1830s, as white men started to build the southwestern empires out of credit and of slaves, they sought more and more risk. This behavior was the forerunner of the cycle of boom and bust that has characterized American history. Now, research psychologists have conducted lengthy studies to conclude that there is a strong connection between sexual desire and risk-taking, decisions about buying and selling, and we could say risk-taking in general. In the context of our historical sketch, financial risk-taking and the sexualized commodification of all enslaved women were, in Andrew Jackson's time, in the 1830s, they were in the minds and the behavior of white entrepreneurs. And these ideas were tangled in a mutually amplifying, if you like, a relationship. In other words, included in the purchase of a female slave, there was the legal right to rape her. But once you make rape legal, that mentality extends to all spheres of life. And this should give you an idea of the spirit, if the word applies, the spirit that enveloped the Southwest at the time. The unrestricted use of power, occasionally checked by fear and revenge murders. Revenge rendered impossible, of course, to the slaves. Jefferson, who in my view was the most humane and decent among the first 12 presidents, realized that unchecked power twists the mind of man. And he said, "The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances." The notable association of prospected unending wealth, more slave ownership, commodification of slaves, and sex should also be considered in the context of the principles that, at least in theory, stood behind the foundation of the North American colonies and then the United States. As we all know, the official colonizer of New England were the Puritans, and their, let us say, restrictive perspective on what is a sin and what isn't permeated, at least on the surface, the development of American culture considered as a whole. Therefore, the lure of freedom from any restraint of any type in business, in slave ownership, in legalized enforced sex, stood in stark contrast with the official, we could say, politically correct view of life as derived from the New England colonizing experiment. Official view reinforced by the many so-called religious reformers and preachers that abounded especially in the North and especially in the first half of the 19th century, for example, the Mormon movement being an example. The standards in the North were, as you can imagine, at least on the surface, remarkably different from the South. And this showed up particularly during the 2 years long Petticoat War, so-called, that ended up when everybody in Andrew Jackson's cabinet resigned. I will say something about the Petticoat War, for again, it gives an idea of the cultural atmosphere of Andrew Jackson's presidency. The principal character of the story is Peggy ONeal, daughter of an innkeeper who grew up in her father's tavern, by itself considered a poor reference at the time. At the age of 17, she married a Navy purser by the name of John Timberlake. Then Peggy and her husband met a 28-year-old widower, Senator John Eaton. They became good friends, and Eaton helped John Timberlake with some debts. When Timberlake was at sea, Peggy remained friends with Eaton, and rumors grew that the two were having an affair. And then the mysterious death of Timberlake in 1828 didn't help matters. The capital was filled with gossip that Timberlake had slit his own throat upon hearing of his supposed adulterous wife. Then Peggy, without even waiting 1 year before remarrying, she married John Eaton, who was rumored to be her lover. Many women refused to go along to attend the wedding, and as a senator's wife, Peggy was supposed to have a certain amount of social standing. But, as you can imagine, this did not happen. Nor did it happen when President Andrew Jackson, a good friend of both Peggy and her senator husband, appointed this senator as Secretary of War. Jackson stood up for her and tried to better her reputation however he could. And this was the beginning of the Petticoat War waged by the women of Washington. The Eaton affair engulfed the capital for over 2 years and only ended when everyone, as I said, in Andrew Jackson's cabinet resigned, either willingly or by force. But in the aftermath of the Petticoat War, supporters of Peggy ONeal's went up in the world, critics lost their political traction, and they lost it. So, which contributed all this to the election of Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States. It would be nice to say that Peggy lived a pleasant life after all this dreadful business, but it is not really the case. After Eaton's death in 1856, she remarried. 3 years later, at the age of 59, she married a 19-year-old Italian dancing instructor who stole her fortune ran away with her granddaughter. So this infamous Peggy Eaton, who had so much influence in politics, died in poverty in 1879. As I said, I brought up the Petticoat War to show how all this supposedly respect for propriety and morality was upside down in the South. One allegorical image made popular by song and lyrics was that of a so-called sable Venus, a mythical African Venus riding in a shell pulled across the Atlantic from Angola by a school of harnessed fish. An enslaver of dubious fame by the name of Thomas Thistlewood left a record of the names of 109 female slaves with whom he coupled. African slaves deemed attractive were simply called fancy, and the abolitionist Ethan Allen Andrews, who toured the property of one prosperous slave owner, was told that mulattoes are not so much valued for field hands, they are purchased for domestic, and the females are sold for prostitutes. By the way, the word mulatto was coined in the late 16th century, and it comes from the Arabic mawallah, person of mixed race. In another case, South Carolina Governor John Henry Hammond bought a woman and her daughter. The mother became her sexual partner, and when the daughter was 12, he made the girl his victim as well. He also molested his 4 white nieces, creating a scandal that ruined their individual marital prospects. But still, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, so you get an idea. Let's conclude this excursion on the shadowy aspect of slavery by saying that slave traders and slave owners experience the peculiar kind of power that an outlaw feels when everybody knows about his crimes, but he manages to get away with it. The exploitation of enslaved women has, of course, a long history, but now you had a different twist. The new trade branded and marketed the ability, if you like, to coerce sexuality. That is, the purchase of enslaved people as commodities offered white men freedoms not found in ordinary life. Branded slave trading was sexy for sellers and for buyers. Now let's go back to the economic financial aspect of the slave trade in the context of the, as I said before, cotton fever that spread like a contagion in the South. Enslavers wanted to transform their control over enslaved people into authority over their own credit. After all, it was calculated that 20% of the whole US economy and assets consisted of slaves. To this effect, a new bank was established, the Consolidated Association of Planters of Louisiana, and in one momentous decision that was to have dramatic consequences, as we will see later, the Louisiana legislature backed the bonds issued by the bank with the faith and credit of Louisiana. In other words, if loan repayments from planters failed and the bank could not pay the bonds, the taxpayers of Louisiana were obligated to do so. And this is almost a duplicate of what happened recently in Greece. Now, the equivalent of the Louisiana Bank in Greece could not repay the bonds issued to various mega speculators or similar. And the nation of Greece is selling out hundreds of islands, privatizing, which means selling off national assets, raising taxes on the poor via the nefarious sales tax. And all this because the bank who issued those questionable and risky loans were backed by the faith and credit of Greece in our instance. And now European banks come more heavily on the scene. Tens of thousands of slaves were still listed as collateral managed to a lender, but the banks securitized the slave mortgages. And securitization is the pooling of debt from many borrowers so that it can be sold in uniform chunks, reducing the risk inherent in lending to one person at a time. This was remarkably similar to the securitized bonds backed by mortgages on US homes that attracted investors worldwide to the US financial market and created the bubble that collapsed in 2008. Time is running out. In the next episodes we will cover the events that eventually led to the Civil War and the Emancipation Declaration. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jimmy Mollia for Historical Sketches.